You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We tried to spice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood, art Ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today we're talking about Mount Rushmore, and my guest literally wrote the book on the topic, A Biography of a Mountain, The Making and Meaning of Mount Rushmore. Thank you so much for coming to join me, Matthew Davis.
You're very welcome, Kyle. Thanks so much for having me and wanting to discuss this new book.
Now, yeah, when this one came my way, I was immediately interested because Mount Rushmore is a fascinating monument with kind of a tragic backstory. I do think it's important to start with, the meaning of this and really even the meaning before it was a monument. I think we need to start off at the very beginning. This was a sacred space. Can you talk a little bit about the origin of Mount Rushmore?
Sure. Well, I can talk a little bit about the origin of the story of the Black Hills in terms of that contentious history. But it's funny, you've been calling it a monument. And when I first started this project, I was talking to a Mount Rushmore park ranger and called it a monument. And he was like, it is a memorial, not a monument. And I was like, got it. Okay. And I think what's interesting about that distinction is that a memorial tends to remember something, right? And in the case of Mount Rushmore, it is memorializing the first 150 years of American history. That's its point, or the first 150 years of the United States, I guess I should say. But you're right. I mean, the Black Hills of South Dakota, where Mount Rushmore is both beautiful and historically very compelling and fraught. The Black Hills for thousands of years were and still are home to dozens of indigenous communities, indigenous tribes. I think most closely associated with the Black Hills today are the Lakota Nation, and the Lakota call the Black Hills the heart of everything that is. They believe that they came to the earth from a cave in the Black Hills, a cave called Wind Cave, and which is now a national park. And from there, from Wind Cave, both the buffalo first emerged, and then the Lakota people emerged. And so the Black Hills have a deep place in the cosmological understanding of the Lakota. There are many sites in the Black Hills and around the Black Hills that are very sacred to the Lakota. And beyond the spiritual element, it has served a very practical purpose for the Lakota and many other tribes throughout the course of thousands of years. I mean, there are a lot of buffalo in the Black Hills, and there's a lot of other sources of food, of medicine, of shelter that the indigenous communities like the Lakota have used for many years. And to bring the story up to the 19th century, in 1868, there was a treaty that was signed between the United States and the Lakota called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. And that treaty was signed because the U.S. sued the Lakota for peace. The Lakota were led by the great leaders Red Cloud and Crazy Horse, were attacking American military forts and Americans that were coming into Lakota territory trying to build forts and communities. And the United States could not defeat the Lakota. So they asked them to stop attacking these communities in exchange for a very broad swath of land that was going to be theirs for forever. And that land was not limited to, but it included all of what is today Western South Dakota. So you're talking about the Black Hills of South Dakota, which, of course, is where Mount Rushmore is. And as you said, I mean, no sooner really than that treaty was signed, less than a decade later, the United States took the Black Hills and the land from the Lakota in a series of different historical events, many of which involved the figure of George Armstrong Custer. Custer had led an expedition through the Black Hills in 1874, which found gold, which set off a lot of American miners wanting to come into the Black Hills and search for gold, which, according to the treaty, was illegal. But the president at the time, Ulysses S. Grant, sort of had been very determined to prevent Americans from coming in. But when gold was found, decided that it would be impossible to not let Americans go in. So he reverted to trying to place Native Americans on different American-run reservations, and those that refused to be on those reservations would be "quote unquote" rounded up. And Custer then was involved in the rounding up. He, met the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne famously at the Battle of Little Bighorn in June 1876. The Native Americans called it the Battle of Greasy Grass, and Custer was soundly defeated. The 7th Cavalry he led was mostly wiped out. When word got back to the East Coast of the United States what had happened, an enraged U.S. decided to take the Black Hills, and in 1877, the Black Hills were indeed taken from the Lakota. And so, the fact that Mount Rushmore is on this land that is both sacred to the Lakota and was illegally taken is a real point of contention for many people in the area.
Yeah, I mean it's so there's so much in there that is absolutely tragic. I mean, you have this ancestral land that dates back to, their origins as a people. I think I've read translations saying like it's they called it something like the 6 grandfathers or something like that area. Am I right in that? I cannot say the name in the native
In the
language.
Mount Rushmore itself, the mountain that bears the sculpture that is called Mount Rushmore today, that used to be called both Cougar Mountain and the 6 Grandfathers. I mean, it's called the 6 Grandfathers because there was a great Lakota visionary, holy man, medicine man, a man named Black Elk, who, when he was 9 years old, had a vision that took him to the tallest peak in the Black Hills, a peak which today bears his name, but at the time was called Harney Peak. And from the distance of Harney Peak, you can see what is today Rushmore. And Black Elk gave that mountain the name 6 Grandfathers in homage to the 6 deities that sort of brought him this vision. So Rushmore was named the 6 Grandfathers initially, and then it turned into Rushmore.
Yeah, and I mean, it just in the broad strokes, like they had this sacred space. The U.S. military couldn't defeat them, so they made peace, saying, "We will give you that space in perpetuity, or until we discover that it can be profitable for us." And then they start violating the treaty and take the Lakota fighting back as a sign of aggression, and then used that as a pretext to take the Black Hills. Is that the general gist of the back and forth that happened there?
Yeah, that's the general gist. I mean, it's a process that was very common across the entire American West, the entire American continent, where the United States would engage in treaties with native tribes, native communities, and then break those treaties when they no longer serve their purpose. And that was certainly the case in the sense of the Treaty of Fort Laramie. I mean, there was also, the two real, the one real sort of impetus to break the treaty was that discovery of gold. I mean, I think because the United States is and was what it was, that land probably would have eventually landed into the hands of the United States, and maybe it would not have been as quickly, and maybe it would not have been as violently, and maybe it would not have been as traumatic as it ended up being, because what happened is not just that the land was taken, but that what came next was even more dispossession of native communities, and the Lakota in particular, in terms of breaking up all the other land that was given to them in the treaty. Their children were put in residential boarding schools, where American culture was put into them and taught them, as opposed to what they had learned from their relatives in native communities. And then also, you had a series of very violent episodes, Wounded Knee being the most famous of them in 1890, where many innocent and unarmed Lakota were killed by American military. So it wasn't simply just the taking of the land, it was sort of what came after that also caused a great deal of historical trauma for the Lakota. And I think one of the things that you see at Mount Rushmore today is is that those stories are not really told, right? I mean, there's a certain narrative that happens at Mount Rushmore that is better today than it was 25 years ago, but that still not tell the full, complete picture of what happened in the Black Hills.
Yeah, and I'm old enough to remember probably a slightly different version of the history than is commonly taught. Not entirely wrong, but if I recall, one like sort of the initial origin story I remember hearing about it was that like, oh, it was going to be a roadside attraction to bring tourists in. And initially they thought like, oh, we'll do Western people like Wild Bill. And then it morphed into the presidents because they wanted it to be more grand. Can you just tell us like, how did this whole plan come about with the transformation of this sacred natural landscape to a carving of people's heads in granite? Like how does that happen? Who came up with that and why?
This is my favorite part of the story because you're right. I mean, the initial conception of what would become Mount Rushmore was very economic centric, economic based. I mean, it goes back to the state historian of South Dakota, a man named Doane Robinson, and Doane Robinson had lived in South Dakota for a number of years, number of decades. He was kind of a Renaissance man. He was someone interested in the kind of alfalfa that farmers grew, the design of the state flag, the kinds of bridges that were being built over the Missouri River. In the 1920s, early 1920s, he became very attuned to the struggling South Dakota economy. And the reason why South Dakota's economy was really struggling was that commodities and agricultural prices had tanked following World War I. And so there were a lot of farmers who were going through difficult times. Banks were closing, people were unemployed. And Doane Robinson thought it was time to diversify South Dakota's economy away from agriculture. And so had this idea to, as you just said, attract tourists to the Black Hills who were then beginning to really drive automobiles. This was the beginning of the automobile boom and automobile tourism. And so there were people driving around this part of the country. And Doane Robinson thought if we could build a sculpture into the Black Hills, that would be a roadside attraction. That would be an attraction for tourists to come and see and visit and generate economy and business for these different communities in and around the Black Hills. And you're right. The initial idea was to carve figures of the American West into the needles or pinnacles of the Black Hills. So we're talking about the Lakota Leader Red Cloud. We're talking about Lewis and Clark, Custer, Sacagawea, other figures that are not necessarily. I mean, Custer is very controversial, and as is Lewis and Clark. But I think what happened was, this idea sort of carried water until Doane Robinson asked the sculptor of Mount Rushmore, Gunnson Borglum, to come and do the project. And once Borglum took on the project, it really shifted very quickly from one that was economic focused, although to be clear, the economic aspect never truly went away, but it changed into much more of a vision of politics. Borglum wanted to create an homage to the American political system. He wanted to create presidents that represented American empire and American expansion. And so it shifted from one where Robinson wanted to reflect the Western character of South Dakota towards one that was much more national in its scope.
And I think that is a perfect sort of lead up and cliffhanger. So after a short break, I want to talk about just how he created this work and what the grand vision was, what he was able to execute and where it kind of fell short and changed along the way. Welcome back. My guest today is Matthew Davis, the author of a new book about Mount Rushmore. Listeners, if you're interested, check the links in the show notes. The book is called A Biography of a Mountain, The Making and Meaning of Mount Rushmore. And so I want to get into just how was this made? You know, you said when the sculptor came along, he had a more grand vision than they initially planned for this roadside attraction. But like, can you talk about what was that grand vision? Because my understanding is it didn't all come to pass.
Well, no, it did not all come to pass. I mean, the in its full grandiosity, if you will, it did not come to pass, but it came pretty close to hitting the marks that Borglum wanted. I mean, Borglum very soon after he decided to take on this project settled on carving four presidents into Mount Rushmore. I mean, he stumbled across this mountain on a sort of scouting expedition for different places to carve, and this is one of the last sites that he saw, and this is where he wanted to carve his presidents, and he wanted to do these four men because they represented American empire, American expansion. And from the very beginning, they came to sort of represent different elements to that story. So for George Washington, it was the birth of the United States. For Thomas Jefferson, it was the expansion in terms of the Louisiana Purchase of the United States. For Lincoln, it was the preservation and saving of the United States in the Civil War. And for Theodore Roosevelt, it was the unity and development of the United States through, he was the president when the Panama Canal was opened. Roosevelt also happened to be a close friend of Borglum, so that doesn't hurt if you want to have your face on the mountain. But so that was how he came to those ideas. And then the actual process by which this began to be created and was created and ultimately then ended, it was very tumultuous. It was fits and starts throughout the course of over, 14 years. So the first carving, my book is tied to the first dedication of Mount Rushmore, which happened on October 1st, 1925. But the first carving didn't start until August 10th, 1927. That was when the first drill bits were drilled in to Mount Rushmore, and construction stopped on October 31st, 1941, just weeks before the U.S. was attacked at Pearl Harbor, which says a lot about that time period. But, throughout those 14 years, there were, especially at the beginning, there were real doubts whether this would even be able to be accomplished. Money was very slow to come by, and it wasn't until Calvin Coolidge, before he left office in 1929, signed legislation that allowed for money to be allocated to the Rushmore project, that the project became part of a federal drive to build Mount Rushmore, and also was able to sort of have a consistent flow of money. But even that, there were fits and starts, because the initial legislation required there to be matching funds that was raised to access federal money, and they struggled to raise those funds. When FDR became president, he was much more supportive of the project and sort of gave and signed legislation that gave more and more money to Mount Rushmore. Ultimately, though, as the years went by and the 1930s, we all know historically what was happening in Europe with the rise of fascism, the rise of Nazism. FDR was very attuned to the fact that the U.S. would be needing to preserve and conserve money for national security and defense. And so at some point, the money ran out on Mount Rushmore. And Borglum had this vision of, having not just the faces of these four presidents, but he wanted to include their torsos. If you look at George Washington closely, you'll see that began to be constructed, but for the other presidents, that was not the case. And then Borglum had this very grandiose vision of creating what he called a hall of records just in the back of the memorial, the back of the sculpture, that would include lots of things, including busts, smaller busts of Americans who had played a role in American history. Or he wanted to put in the original documents of the Constitution or Declaration of Independence. And he wanted to do this to really try to contextualize Mount Rushmore. His deepest concern was that, hundreds of years from now, people would look at these faces and not have any idea who they were, or not have any idea of the context in which they were built. He feared that, at some point Mount Rushmore would become like the faces of Easter Island, which are sort of haunting, but we don't really know exactly what they're doing there. And so that's why he wanted to create all this context for the memorial, and that was really the part that did not get complete. It was an arduous process, even just to complete the four faces. The Hall of Records would have required even more money, and at a certain point, FDR said, "Listen, we can't give you any more," and that it's sort of a what's interesting about that is that Borglum learned that he was not going to get the full funds that he wanted literally on his deathbed. I mean, he was in March of 1941. He made a trip. He was going to make a trip to Washington, D.C. to raise money, but he stopped in Chicago and saw a doctor there because he was having prostate problems and had surgery. And he was on bed rest recuperating from surgery when he received word that the funding was not going to go forward. And then shortly thereafter, he passed away because of blood clots and complications to the surgery. And so there was a period from March until October where his son, Lincoln Borglum, was really in charge of the memorial and the finishing touches of the memorial. So putting the final touches on the faces, but then they had to leave and run out of money. And I think you see that in part through, if you look at the memorial now when you're there, or pictures of it, you'll see a huge pile of rubble that's right below the faces. And that initially was supposed to be cleared out, but they ran out of money. So that pile of rubble is still there. So small details like that I find pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to it that is absolutely amazing. I hadn't thought about that perspective of him trying to contextualize these figures so future generations would know why those figures are on the mountain. That is fascinating, especially when you consider the deeper history and context of that location. There's a lot to unpack there, but I also think, the idea of like it's granite face to the mountain. Which is a material that, if I recall correctly, like it's extremely slow eroding. Like it's meant to be a type of stone that is gonna stand the test of time and be around for centuries, if not millennia. Which I think is really saying something to his ambition with this monument, or this memorial. Sorry, I'm still in the bad habits. But it feels to me like it's a lot of misery over trying to make something permanent, and it feels in some ways like such the it feels to me like such the folly almost, but that feels too light of a word to try to carve something permanent of humanity in the side of the mountain. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I look at it from a few different perspectives. When this idea was first being discussed in the 1920s, there were many people in the Black Hills who were opposed to it for the ideas that you're sort of describing. I think people were questioning whether humans could improve on the work of God. For example, this Mother Nature, this beauty that's in the Black Hills. Why would you try to improve upon it by carving figures into it? There wasn't the kinds of discussions that we're having now about whether they should do it from a political perspective in terms of the sensitivity and understanding we have of the land being sacred Lakota territory and land, and whether we should be carving figures into the Black Hills. I mean, it wasn't discussed from that perspective as much as it was whether we should be doing this just more generally speaking. I think there wasn't people thought of it potentially as a potential folly, but there was a great deal of support for it too, Kyle. I mean, you can read the newspapers at the time, and especially locally, there's a great deal of optimism for this project in terms of what it would look like and what it would mean for this part of South Dakota. So I don't think people really thought of it in that way. I mean, there's certainly, you can make the arguments today that it is a great deal of hubris for humans to want to sort of carve out parts of nature for and make it into art. But that wasn't really something that was hugely discussed at the time, and so Borglum went forward, and he had learned a great deal from what he was the original sculptor of the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial in Atlanta, Georgia, and he dealt with granite then, and he learned about dynamiting granite, and he learned about carving outdoors and working with local communities and lobbying the federal government. He took all of that with him to Mount Rushmore, and I don't think he ever really saw what he was doing as a point of folly. I think he saw what he was doing, certainly as a point of pride, and as a real representation of the apotheosis of Western civilization, which to him meant the American political system.
Can you talk just a little bit about, because this is an art podcast, I do want to get into just like the process a little bit. I mean, like, how does one begin to carve up a mountain?
It's such a great question. And the way that Borglum did it was that he created smaller models of Mount Rushmore, what he envisioned it to look like when it was complete. And those maquettes were then, it's called a pointing system. It's a classical system. For each sort of inch on the maquette, that was going to represent a foot on the mountain. So he sort of used those measurements and used different tools to be able to take what he was using at the maquette and put it on the actual mountain itself. And so he began with the nose of George Washington. That was the first thing that he began to sort of measure out in terms of what it would look like on the model and where it would be on the mountain. And from there, the entirety of Mount Rushmore began to come into focus. And it was a real act of faith to do this. There's not the kinds of technologies that we use today in terms of laser scanning and inputting all this material into a computer. I mean, there were no environmental studies. There was no guarantee that the granite itself would eventually reveal carvable material. And so what they had to do initially was just blow a lot of it off with dynamite. So like I said, he had learned that technique at Stone Mountain in Atlanta, and he applied it very liberally to Mount Rushmore, where they would, set off charges of dynamite and have the granite explode off, and then they would do it in smaller and smaller capsules until they got to material that they could really work with and manipulate with carving tools. They used a process called channeling, where they would put these really small dynamite caps in different periods across the stone and like send little shocks, and then they'd sweep the stone out, and then they take the tools to actually carve in to the granite. And all of that was from these models that Borglum had. So there's some great photographs that are actually in my book that you can see where these workers called pointers, who were instrumental in sort of translating the maquette to the mountain, where they're on the maquette sort of measuring these different inches of space, and then you'd have a much bigger model or much bigger instrument that would translate that to feet. And the way that they would do this were workers, a lot of them who were local, a lot of them who were not artists. They would tended to be miners or ranchers or just people who, were needing work or unemployed, would sit in these chairs dangling hundreds of feet up from the ground, and they'd be holding these heavy pieces of equipment and would be, carving or jackhammering or working with the granite that they were assigned to, and they would shout out up to these younger men who were literally holding them up in the air on these winch houses like little marionettes, and they would say lower, higher, there, and they would lower a little bit, they'd get higher a little bit. And it was reading the oral histories of the men who worked on the mountain in this way. It was not for the faint of heart. Many people couldn't do it. Many people got in these chairs with these heavy pieces of equipment, and they looked down and they said, nope, not for me, and asked to be brought right back up.
Yeah, I would have been one of those nope people. Like I would not be able to do that. And one thing that occurred to me as you were talking about like the sort of leap of faith of like they're blasting away and hoping there's a good usable surface underneath. I seem to recall reading somewhere that there was a problem with, I think, Jefferson or something. Am I right in that? Didn't something went wrong in that process of creation, or there was a hiccup?
You are right. No, that's exactly what happened. There was a Jefferson was in the initial sculpture in the initial model. Jefferson was supposed to be to the left of Washington. So if you're facing Mount Rushmore, right now Jefferson's to the right. He was supposed to be on the left. And what happened was Borglum was away one summer in Europe to dedicate another memorial that he was working on, and so the people that were left behind at Rushmore, there's an old joke or story that when Gunnson Borglum was on the mountain, people were very conservative in the amount of dynamite they used because Borglum was very conservative and not wanting to blow off more than that he could. You can't put granite back on to the mountain once it's blown off. So, but when he was away,
I just love that someone's being described as conservative about how they blow up part of a mountain.
yes, right, exactly. But when he was away that summer, the workers got a little too liberal in their use of dynamite, and so there was they blew off too much of the face, and so there was or the mountain face, not the actual face, and so there was a lack of carvable granite that where Jefferson's face was going to be going, and they had started carving the face already. I mean, it wasn't like they blew off all this space and they said, "Oh, we can't do this." There was already parts of Jefferson's face that were on this part of the mountain, so they had to stop work and shift it over to the right. And it's that was not. I mean, that's a dramatic example of sort of the trial and error, but that it was very much a work of trial and error. I mean, one of my favorite parts of writing this book was spending time with the South Dakota artist laureate Dale Lamphere, and he and I, spent an afternoon staring up at the sculpture, and he sort of pointed out different artistic aspects of the sculpture to me that I never would have thought of if not for my conversation with him. And he's an older man, Dale is, and he was the artist who created the replica of Mount Rushmore for its 50th year of completion. And so he became able to really go on top of the mountain and dangle and see the faces to sort of get a sense of how to replicate them. And what he told me is that the first two faces that were done were Washington and Jefferson. And you might not see it from afar, but up close, there's a lot of holes in those faces that they sort of made mistakes on and realized they were not going in the right direction and so had to change course. But that as you got further along, when you got to Roosevelt and to Lincoln, the last two faces that were carved, they really learned a lot more about the process, about how to do this. And so there's fewer errors in those faces than there are in the first two. So it truly was some sort of process that was of trial and error, and it's kind of a miracle that it is up as good as it is. I mean, you can talk all you want about whether Mount Rushmore is a good piece of art. I will say that Gunnson Borglum was an incredibly talented artist. Some of his sculptures and paintings are really beautiful. I think because of the scale of Mount Rushmore, it kind of prevents there to be any sense of real deep beauty. But the engineering feat that it took to create Mount Rushmore should not be discounted.
Yeah, I would agree. I have a lot of very mixed feelings about Mount Rushmore because, knowing the history, it's hard to enjoy the work. But I do have to say, just like objectively, like it's well rendered for, the huge challenge that it presented. And so after one last short break, I want to talk more about the legacy and the work and how we interpret this and how we sort of think about this piece today. Welcome back. My guest today is Matthew Davis, the author of the new book about Mount Rushmore, Biography of a Mountain. And, the book is all about making and meaning of Mount Rushmore. And as we've already alluded to, it's a complicated story. It's fascinating, but I have a lot of mixed feelings about this. I want to hear from you because you've obviously researched a lot more than I have. How do you sort of think of this and frame this, and what meaning do you take from it today, and how has that meaning maybe shifted over time?
The meaning of Mount Rushmore has evolved over the past 100 years, from its first inception in October 1925 to how we view it today. And I think how we view it today as Americans in particular, sort of reflects a little bit about how you view different historical narratives, American historical narratives. There is a real, I mean, one of my biggest takeaways from doing this book is just that monuments, memorials, whether they're Mount Rushmore or the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Memorial or Statue of Liberty, their meanings are not static, and they tend to really reflect our times rather than the times in which they were built, and vice versa as well. I think the initial conception of a memorial or a monument oftentimes reflects the periods that they were built and not so much the periods that they're trying to represent. So what was going on in 1925 in the Black Hills of South Dakota added a whole lot to what the initial ideas of Mount Rushmore were, the initial meanings of Mount Rushmore were. But from 100 years later, we can have a different perspective on those meanings. We can understand, the conversations we were having earlier about how, the land that it was built in is sacred land to the Lakota, and ask the question whether this is the best place to have this kind of memorial. Those kinds of questions were not asked 100 years ago. I'm sure 100 years from now, we'll be asking a whole host of other questions about, the meaning of Mount Rushmore and other monuments and memorials. And I think that's really healthy. I think that's great. And that's how monuments and memorials should function, is they should not be, their meanings should not be locked in granite or in marble or in concrete. They should be able to evolve as we evolve. I think today, one of the things that I learned, and I am not from South Dakota, I'm not Native American, so I came at this from a real outsider's perspective, is that there are very many different meanings that people have at Mount Rushmore, both locally within the Black Hills, but also nationally. And I think one of the challenges that we face as Americans, one of the challenges that we have when we encounter a memorial like Mount Rushmore is asking, can we fit all the complications of the history of the land, of the emotion that's behind all that into this one space? And if so, how do we do it? And I think that's something that the memorials is really wrestling with today. And I think that's something that we as all Americans are really wrestling with today. I mean, so many of us, Kyle, as want to feel pride and patriotism in our country, but are wary about what that means in terms of being able to reflect on some of the darker parts of our past, of our history that have made it hard for everyone to feel welcome in the United States and to feel pride in the United States. And so that's where it really, really gets tricky.
Yeah, and I think, your point about the meaning changing, I think that's really interesting. There are so many different lenses that we can use to look at a work of art. And I think it's important to always remember that the artist's intention is not the final word on any piece of art. That, regardless of what they intend, a publicly viewed work of art, the reaction that it gets from the public, the ideas and emotions it elicits, those are just as valid and arguably more important than what the initial creator intended. And this is a work that I like I said, I have a lot of mixed feelings about, because there's a part of me that sees it as just like absolutely tragic that, the Lakota lands were taken and defaced in a way that, you can't undo the blasting, you know. And on the other hand, I also recognize that for a lot of people it is awe-inspiring to see this massive grand sculpture, and it elicits feelings, like you said, patriotism and pride, and you can't unring the bell. And I don't know where to put it. And I think, you know my cop out is, at least we can have the conversation and grapple with these ideas, because I don't know what to do with it, other than to say, like, we can talk about it and we can learn from it.
Yeah, I think there's also, one of the things that I explore in my book, is there are ways through different means, in particular through potentially ceremony, that will allow us to really take in the emotional and historical complexity to Mount Rushmore and to the Black Hills. And there's also some questions that we can ask. I mean, I think, like, one of the things I do in my book is just to ask, what is a memorial? Who is it for? What stories does it tell? Where is it placed? If you think through those questions at a place like Mount Rushmore, or for other, memorials and monuments across the country, that might prompt you to think more about, how they came to be and what purposes are they serving, and what meanings they might have today. So, for example, like, the question of Mount Rushmore really, it comes down to where it is placed, and to some degree what histories it's telling. I mean, when I first visited Mount Rushmore, in 2000, there really wasn't much of a story that reflected the histories and the current usage of the hills for indigenous and native communities. And it wasn't until 2004, when a Native American superintendent named Gerard Baker was hired to lead Mount Rushmore, that those histories became more formally involved and introduced to the memorial. So Baker created a Lakota historical village right next to the sculpture. He invited cultural performers like hoop dancers to come and perform at Mount Rushmore. He hired Native American interpreters to tell the stories of their tribes and communities that have lived in the Black Hills for thousands of years. And so it began to sort of open up the aperture to the stories that Mount Rushmore told, and I think really important ways. And that continues to this day. And then maybe not to the same degree as it did under Baker, but those stories still are present there, which I think is very important. I mean, then the larger question of where it is placed is really the key element to this, right? I mean, we've talked a lot about, how it's very complicated that Rushmore is in the Black Hills. And one of the things that I ask in the book is, how would we view Mount Rushmore if what we see, if this sculpture of the four presidents was taken out of the Black Hills and then put on the National Mall, for example, or if it were, carved into the Palisades just outside of New York City, or, in the Great Falls of Virginia, just outside of where I live in Washington, D.C. I mean, how would we react to that sculpture and if it were in those different places? And I think that what that does is really, get at this discussion of where it is placed, which I think is the crucial point of Mount Rushmore, because of the real, history that we were exploring earlier in our conversation.
Yeah, and it is fascinating, and there's so much to unpack there. And I really appreciate your taking the time for this thoughtful conversation on the history, the legacy, and the meaning of Mount Rushmore. And listeners, if you want to do a deeper dive, I highly recommend the book Biography of a Mountain by Matthew Davis is available at your favorite bookstore, or just check the links in the show notes. But thanks again, Matthew Davis. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Kyle, thanks so much for having me. It was great.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.